When the Senate passed the CARES Act back in March, we were trying to prepare the nation for economic paralysis and the medical battle of the century at the very same time. Hospitals, healthcare providers, small businesses, and working families needed help fast, and the Senate stepped up in historic fashion. For months, our legislation has helped cushion the pain of the crisis from coast to coast. But our nation is not finished with this fight. More Americans are dying every day. Millions and millions are unemployed. And the institutions of American life cannot stay totally shut down until our race for a vaccine hits the finish line. Our nation needs to smartly and safely reopen while keeping up the medical battle. We need to get kids safely back to school and adults safely back to work without losing ground in the healthcare fight. The coronavirus does not care that we are divided. The coronavirus will not care if Washington Democrats decide it suits their partisan goals to let relief run dry. The American people are hurting, and Congress should have their backs. On Monday, I laid down a marker to shape the bipartisan conversations that need to happen now, not a loony ideological fantasy like the House Democrats' bill from a few months ago, which would have cut taxes for rich people, raised taxes on small business, and provided no additional round for the Paycheck Protection Program. No serious talks require actually a serious starting point. That's why we wrote a serious bill containing largely bipartisan policies. Another round of cash for households, more than $3,000 for an eligible family of four, with even more support for adult dependents. Another round of additional federal unemployment benefits, assistance which will otherwise simply expire. And another targeted round of the Paycheck Protection Program to prevent even more layoffs and keep paychecks coming to American workers. Powerful new incentives to jumpstarting rehiring, bring down unemployment, and create safe workplaces for workers and customers. More support for hospitals and health providers. More support for testing, PPE, and diagnostics. And more resources for the sprint toward a vaccine. And historic support for schools to reopen, a higher dollar amount than House Democrats managed to propose in their bill, which cost 3 times as much as ours. And uniting all 3 pillars of kids, jobs, and healthcare, we have legal protections for medical workers, schools, nonprofits, and businesses, so that well-connected trial lawyers can't get even richer off stopping the recovery in its tracks. This is a more than fair, more than bipartisan framework for Democrats to engage with. The only reason I can see that Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leader would sabotage negotiations is if, as some concluded when they killed police reform in June, they actually think bipartisan progress for the country would hurt their own political chances. That's why I said a few days ago that we'd quickly learn whether the American people would be getting the responsible Democratic Party from March or the cynical obstructionist Democratic Party from June that blocked police reform. So let's review the early going. Almost the instant we put out this proposal, which would send thousands of dollars in cash to families and even more cash to unemployed people, the Democratic leader proclaimed, quote, "Those Republican hard right money people don't want the federal government to help anybody," end quote. $1 trillion proposal for kids, jobs, and health care just proves Republicans don't want to help anyone. Yesterday, after a meeting with the administration, the Speaker of the House said, quote, "This isn't a negotiation." So here we go again, Madam President. It's the script from police reform all over again. Weeks of talk from Democrats about the urgency of the issue.
I'm going to refresh the page, guys. Okay, 1 second. I'm refreshing the page so it's a little bit clearer, okay?
Time to actually make a law. Democrats would rather keep political issues alive than find a bipartisan way to resolve them. Take the issue of additional federal unemployment insurance. For weeks now, it's been clear to a majority of Americans that we should not pay people more to stay home than we pay people who continue working. Should we have generous unemployment insurance in this crisis? Of course. Republicans want to continue the federal supplement at 8 times the level Democrats themselves put in place during the last recession. But obviously, we should not be taxing the essential workers who kept working so the government can pay their neighbors a higher salary to stay home. Let me say that again. We should not be taxing the essential workers who kept working so the government can pay their neighbors a higher salary to stay home. Until about 5 minutes ago, this was not a controversial opinion. Democrats shared it with us. The House Democratic Majority Leader said yesterday, quote, "That's an argument that has some validity to it. It's not $600 or bust." A few days earlier, our Democratic colleague, Senator Coons, said he thought we'd be finding some path forward with a different dollar figure. The day before yesterday, our colleague, Senator Cardin, said, quote, "What is the right number?" Well, we certainly understand we don't want someone to have higher benefits than what someone can make working. That was Senator Cardin. At the state level, the Democratic governor of Connecticut agrees. This is what he said. "I think sometimes it discourages work. I would put off this extra $600 true-up they're talking about. I don't think we need that." That's the Democratic governor of Connecticut. Like I said, not controversial. The Congressional Budget Office says that 5 out of 6 recipients of this aid, 83%, received more to stay home than they made on the job. Let me say that one more time. The Congressional Budget Office says that 5 of 6 recipients of this aid, 83%, received more to stay home than they made on the job. And we all know that's not fair, and it's not workable in a reopening job market. We've already heard from small business owners who've had trouble reopening because it would be financially irrational for their employees to come back. This is why Republicans propose continuing providing federal aid, continue providing hundreds of dollars per week, but do it in a more targeted way while providing even more incentives for rehiring. But now, Madam President, the Speaker of the House apparently signals she rejects this bipartisan consensus and will not let a package go forward unless we continue paying people more not to work. That's apparently the Speaker's position, that we will not let a package go forward unless we continue paying people more not to work. That's what Speaker Pelosi apparently signaled yesterday. No money for schools, no money for households, no second round of the PPP, no more money for hospitals or testing, nothing at all, unless we continue to pay people more not to work. If the Democrats don't get to continue taxing essential workers to pay other people more to stay home, then nobody gets a dime. To put it gently, Madam President, that's a completely unhinged position. 62% of Americans say that paying people extra to remain unemployed creates the wrong incentive. A Democratic governor says he doesn't want that continuing. Her own deputy, the House Democratic Majority Leader, said yesterday there should be room to negotiate. But Speaker Pelosi is literally moving the goalposts so fast that even Democrats can't keep up. And now she apparently feels that any rescue package will have to be to the political left of her own Democratic Majority Leader, to the political left of the Democratic governor of Connecticut, or she will not even consider it. She'll just refuse to legislate until the election and wish American families good luck in dealing with the pandemic. These are not the positions of people who are putting the common good above politics. These are not the positions of people who actually want to reach an agreement to save federal unemployment insurance from completely expiring. The American people deserve better than this. The American people cannot afford for Democrats in Congress to have decided in June that they're finished legislating until November. Not during a crisis like this. The country needs help. The country needs action. If Democratic leaders decide they won't negotiate, they will answer to the American people.
Okay.
Now, over the past 3 months, Madam President, as Americans stayed home, forfeiting their routines and their livelihoods to combat the spread of the virus, as essential workers risked their safety and their families' safety, as 50 million Americans filed unemployment claims, small businesses folded, and the disease spread rapidly through the summer, the Republican majority paused on addressing COVID-19 while they confirmed more right-wing judges. Americans pitched in and sacrificed, and many suffered greatly, while Senate Republicans kept their assembly line of extreme judicial nominees humming along and did little else. And now, after an interminable delay, Senate Republicans have finally admitted that the country needs relief. But they can't even get their act together to produce a halfway legitimate legislative proposal. We all witness a week and a half of infighting on the Republican side as the country careened towards several cliffs created by Republican delay. Republicans bickered amongst themselves as the moratorium on evictions expired. State and local governments shed jobs and cut public services, and the last enhanced unemployment checks went out the door. When Republicans finally convinced themselves they were ready to unveil a plan, instead of presenting a single coherent bill, Republicans released several incongruent drafts littered with corporate giveaways, K Street handouts, presidential pet projects. Some Republicans proposed billions of dollars for large agribusiness and defense contractors, but not a dime to help American families stay in their homes. The Republican bill has a tax break for 3 martini lunches, but no food assistance for hungry kids. There's $2 billion for a new FBI building, whose location will increase the value of the Trump Hotel, but no funding to help state and local governments retain teachers, firefighters, bus drivers, and other public employees. There's no support for Medicaid, for nursing homes, or those with disabilities. The proposals to support our health system and meet our testing needs are wildly insufficient. And if you're one of the 20 to 30 million of Americans who lost your job through no fault of your own and you can't find work, Senate Republicans think you have it too good right now. You should take a 30% pay cut, Republicans are saying. This is not a serious proposal for a country in the midst of a once-in-a-generation crisis. So as you can imagine, when reviews started rolling in yesterday, they weren't too positive. One Republican senator said, so as you can imagine, when reviews started rolling in yesterday, they weren't too positive. One Republican senator said there are 100 problems with the plan. Another Republican, it's a mess. I can't figure out what this bill is about. Another Republican of this chamber said, you look at the package that was rolled out by the Republican leadership, and it contains virtually nothing that will actually aid in the recovery. Those would be harsh criticisms if they came from Democrats. But those quotes weren't from Democrats. Those were Republican senators talking about their own party's plan. 2 senior Republican senators have said that the Republican proposal would be lucky to get even half of the Republican conference to vote for it. Leader McConnell warned Democrats against blocking the Democratic proposal. It turns out that Senate Republicans are blocking the Republican proposal. So it's abundantly clear that the Senate Republican proposal for the next phase of COVID relief is not a useful starting point. You don't have to take my word for it. Just ask President Trump, who took the podium yesterday afternoon and called the Senate Republican proposal semi-irrelevant. At this point, I'm beginning to wonder who does support the Republican proposal on COVID-19. So here's where we are. We need to turn the page on the Republican proposal, and quickly. The legislative train wreck by Senate Republicans cannot derail our efforts to provide urgent, comprehensive, and necessary relief to the American people. Speaker Pelosi and I have started negotiating with Chief of Staff Meadows and Secretary Mnuchin. We want to work with our Republican colleagues and the White House on a bill that actually meets the needs of the American people in these unprecedented times. But it's going to take good faith and compromise. We're not hearing that from Leader McConnell. Leader McConnell already is drawing lines in the sand, insisting that any agreement include his specific corporate immunity provision. No negotiation put this provision, extreme provision, in the bill without negotiation. That sure doesn't sound like someone who wants to reach a bipartisan agreement. We're going to need everyone to pull together. We're going to need to focus on the needs of the American people. With all due respect to the Republican leader, Americans on the brink of eviction are not crying out for a sweeping corporate liability shield. No one should be willing to torpedo all the relief Americans are counting on unless there's a giant corporate giveaway attached. Time is short. Speaker Pelosi and I will be back at the negotiating table with the White House later today. It's time for our Republican colleagues to roll up their sleeves and get serious as well. And one final point on this subject. Again, this morning, the Republican leader continued his Alice in Wonderland interpretation of what has happened. When what has happened is black, he says white. When what has happened is white, he says black. He's totally the opposite of the truth and what's happened. He suggested that Democrats might be trying to block progress on COVID relief because it might suit our party in the election, that we Democrats had decided to stop legislating until November. I mean, shocking stuff. Over 10 weeks ago, Democrats passed a bill 3 times the size of the Republican proposal that was more generous and beneficial to the American people on nearly every measure. Leader McConnell dismissed it. Senate Democrats spent the entire month of June asking our Republican colleagues, including Leader McConnell, to pass crucial legislation related to jobs, healthcare, and small business. We went on the floor and made those requests. Republicans blocked every single one, nearly every single one of those requests. So this absurd, nasty insinuation by the Republican leader doesn't pass the laugh test. The fact that Leader McConnell would even consider the idea that a political party might deny support for the American people in order to help win an election says more about the Republican leader than anybody else. On another matter, today the Senate will vote on 2 nominations to the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. One nominee from the Republican side and another from the Democratic side. On bipartisan boards and commissions like the NLRB, this used to be the tradition. The president's party always enjoys a majority on these boards, but it's crucial for the opposite party, whoever it is at the time, to have their recommendations approved to these bipartisan boards. Unfortunately, the vote comes today after more than 2 years, during which the Republican majority refused to even schedule a vote on a Democratic nominee to the NLRB, Mark Pierce. The Republicans waited so long that both Democratic nominees that were already on the NLRB had their terms expire. So while Democrats look forward to confirming Lauren McFerrin to the NLRB later today, we are still frustrated that the Republican majority denied any Democratic representation on the board for too long, and they continue to deny a vote on the second Democratic seat. I yield the floor.
Senator, in a phone call.
We're not.
Madam President, I intend to talk about Section 230 here in just a moment. I just wanted to sort of react to what the Democratic leader said and also sort of make some observations generally about where I think we are with respect to a coronavirus relief bill. The Democratic leader indicated that the Republican bill wasn't a serious bill. Frankly, I think it could be argued that the bill that he has endorsed, passed by the House of Representatives, was not a serious bill. It was about $3.5 trillion, which would make it about $1 trillion larger than the massive coronavirus relief bill that we passed unanimously in the Senate back in March. And that bill at the time, for a lot of people, represented something unlike anything they'd ever seen before, both in terms of scale and scope, the expanse of all the issues that it addressed. And I think in many respects, it was a bill that most members believed at the time that we needed to get as much assistance out there as quickly as we could. And as a consequence of that, there was broad support for that. We're at a different point now, obviously several months later, and have some perspective that enables us to look at what might be effective, what's worked, what hasn't worked. We've gotten a lot of input from state and community leaders, from businesses, schools, hospitals, healthcare providers who've been impacted by the virus, and have been able to respond to what has already been done by the Congress in terms of assistance. And so I think at this point, as we look at what the greatest needs are, it's pretty clear that we have to do something to assist those, provide safety net assistance for those who have lost jobs in the form of unemployment insurance. And I think there's a commitment on both sides to address that. I would argue that the proposal advanced by the Democrats, which would just be a continuation of the existing program, is not one that I think most people across this country think is wise policy. And it's certainly to the degree that it provides an incentive for people to stay home and not to go back to work, it does provide a disincentive to work. And I think that's something that this legislation ought to address. And that's pretty much widely held view, not just by Republicans, but by Democrats. There are Democrats here in the Senate, Democrats in the House, Democrat governors who have said that the existing unemployment benefit needs to be modified, needs to be reformed, needs to be revised. The question has been, raised, what level? It strikes me at least that, we ought not be putting a benefit out there that exceeds the amount that people would make if they were actually working. Because what that essentially says is that those who are working, those who stayed in the workforce and are basically paying benefits to those who did not, when in fact, if there was if there wasn't a benefit that exceeded the amount that they made when they were working, they might get back in the workforce if those jobs become available again. And that's certainly something that we want to incentivize. And so I would hope that in any deal that is struck, that as we address unemployment insurance, we can come up with a solution that does tailor it to the need of the moment, and that is to get people back to work. We want to have policies that create jobs. That's something I think that ought to be first and foremost in this bill. We have indicated that this ought to be about kids, getting them back to school in the fall. It ought to be about healthcare. It ought to be about coming up with therapeutics and more testing, better testing. And it ought to be about ultimately, hopefully, getting a vaccine. And then in the meantime, making sure that we are addressing the needs of our providers as doctors and nurses and nursing home caregivers who are on the front lines. So those are the things, the priorities that I think ought to be in this bill. It seems to me there's plenty of room for bipartisan cooperation, but it will take that. And it also strikes me that the suggestion that, you have to do more dollar-wise isn't always necessarily a sound approach. In fact, I would argue that anything that we do right now ought to be targeted. It ought to be focused on those who have needs. If it's assistance to state and local governments, if it's assistance to small businesses who are out there creating jobs, anything that we do at this point ought to be based and predicated upon where the needs are. And we ought to have accountability for the funds that are going out there. And my impression is from the bill passed by the House Democrats and supported by many Senate Democrats here, is that the more we spend, the better it is. And I don't think the American people subscribe to that view. I think they realize, like I do, that we are operating in an environment where we have a $26 trillion debt. And we have already added this year, because of the first coronavirus bill, about another $3 trillion to that debt, and increased our debt to GDP ratio up over 100%, which is pretty dangerous territory if you look at any relevant metric in history. And so I would argue, Madam President, that the approach that we take right now, it ought to be focused, it ought to be targeted, it ought to be measured, and it ought to be directed to those who really have the needs. And by that, I mean people who are unemployed through unemployment insurance. It ought to be to small businesses who are trying to keep their employees employed. and trying to, get back and going again and creating jobs. It ought to be healthcare providers who are dealing with the frontline crisis, and also the heavy investment that we need to make in the ultimate solution, which will be the vaccine. And of course, in terms of the fall, getting kids back to school. And that entails a whole lot more testing. And those are all things that are included in the bill that was put forward by Republicans. Most of the Democrat objections to that bill, Madam President, are that it doesn't spend enough, that it's just not generous enough. Well, again, I think that we have to be very, very careful, very thoughtful, and aware and conscious of the fact that we're operating at a time when we have $26 trillion in debt, where every dollar that we spend is a borrowed dollar. And we need to be effective, surgical, targeted, and wise about how we spend the American people's hard-earned tax dollars. So I'm hopeful that these discussions will lead to a solution. We knew right away that there wasn't going to be unanimous support for this. It's not like the last time around. And I've said all along that I wouldn't expect every Republican to support the bill that came out and was released a couple of days ago. I think it's a starting point, but I hope that the Democrats will negotiate in good faith and not simply try to raise the ante because they have a bill that's already passed the House. It's at $3.5 trillion. That to me, not to mention the size of it, but also the components of it, was a very irresponsible bill. That's not a serious bill. And the fact that it mentions the word cannabis more times than it mentions the word jobs, I think gives you all you need to know about how serious that effort was. But there is a place that we can land that addresses those critical elements that I mentioned, and I hope that notwithstanding the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Democratic leader, that Democrats will enter in good faith into discussions and play a constructive role in trying to come up with a bipartisan solution to the challenges that we face because of an unprecedented and historic pandemic. Madam President, yesterday, in my role as head of the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications Technology, Innovation, and the Internet, I led a hearing looking at proposed reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So what is Section 230? Well, Section 230 provides internet sites that host user-generated content, sites like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, with immunity for the content that users post on their sites. So, for example, if somebody uploads a YouTube video with defamatory content, YouTube isn't held responsible for that content. It's not unfair to say that Section 230 has enabled the internet as we know it. Without Section 230 protections, many of the sites we rely on for social connection or news or entertainment would never have come into being.
I need to hear this.
If a solo blogger, for example, could be held responsible for monitoring each and every comment on his or her site, no matter how many hundreds or thousands there are, it's unlikely blogging would ever have taken off. And if YouTube were responsible for the content of every one of the millions of videos on its site, well, it's unlikely that YouTube would have grown the way that it has. There's a reason that user-generated sites like Twitter and Facebook are U.S. companies and not, for example, European companies. And that's because other countries do not offer the liability protections of Section 230. But Section 230 was written in the infancy of the internet, long before sites like Twitter and Facebook were created. And as we've seen the internet grow, we've come to realize that there are also some changes that need to be made. For example, while I support the principle that sites should not be held responsible for everything that users generate, there's a difference between an inappropriate video a site misses and a site that knowingly allows itself to be used for criminal purposes. In 2018, after it became obvious that certain sites were knowingly allowing themselves to be used by child traffickers and predators, Congress passed a law to hold these and other sites responsible for enabling child sex trafficking. As the previous chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee and current chairman of the Commerce Subcommittee on Communications Technology, Innovation, and the Internet, I've been focusing on internet issues related to user-generated content sites for the past couple of years. I've chaired several hearings on the topic, including a hearing on terrorist content on sites like Twitter and Facebook, and a hearing on the opaque algorithms that these sites use to filter the content that users see. And at the end of June, Senator Schatz and I introduced legislation, the Platform Accountability and Consumer Transparency Act, or the PACT Act, to address some of the issues surrounding Section 230 and user-generated content sites. Our bill would preserve the benefits of Section 230, like the internet growth and widespread dissemination of free speech that it has enabled, while increasing accountability and consumer transparency. One reason that Section 230 has become so controversial is that internet platforms have actively cultivated the notion that they are merely providing the technology for people to communicate and share their thoughts and ideas. But the reality is somewhat different. The truth is, websites have a strong incentive to exercise control over the content each of us sees. Because if they can present us with content that will keep us engaged, we will stay on that site longer. Today, sites like Facebook and Twitter make use of sophisticated content moderation tools,
and YouTube,
algorithms, and recommendation engines to shape the content that we see on these platforms. Now, moderation can certainly improve the user experience. Most of us would prefer that YouTube suggest videos that match our interests rather than something completely unrelated. The problem is that content moderation has been, and largely continues to be, a black box, with consumers having little or no idea how the information that they see has been shaped by the sites that they're visiting. The PACT Act would address this problem by increasing transparency around the content moderation process. It would require internet platforms like Facebook and Twitter to submit quarterly reports to the Federal Trade Commission outlining material that they've removed from their sites or chosen to de-emphasize. For example, posts that they've chosen to mostly exclude from users' feeds. Sites would also be required to provide an easily digestible disclosure of their content moderation practices for users. And importantly, they would be required to explain their decisions to remove material to consumers.
yes.
Until relatively recently, sites like Facebook and Twitter would remove a user's post without explanation and without an appeals process. And even as platforms start to shape up their act with regard to transparency and due process, it is still hard for users to get good information about how content is moderated. Under the PACT Act, if a site chooses to remove your post, it has to tell you why it decided to remove your post and explain how your post violated the site's terms of use. The PACT Act would also require sites to create an appeals process. So if Facebook, for example, removes one of your posts, it would not only have to tell you why, but it would have to provide a way for you to appeal that decision. To some extent, some platforms like Facebook are already starting to do this, but by no means are all of them doing so. The PACT Act would preserve companies' 230 protections for material posted on their sites, but it would require companies to remove material that has been adjudicated as illegal by a court. Large sites like Facebook and Twitter would be required to remove illegal content within 24 hours, while smaller sites would be given additional time. Failure to remove illegal material would result in the sites losing its 230 protections for that content or activity, a provision that matches a recent recommendation made by the Department of Justice for Section 230 reform. Finally, Madam President, in addition to promoting transparency and accountability, the PACT Act also contains measures to strengthen the government's ability to protect consumers. And as the Department of Justice has noted in its recommendations to reform Section 230, broad Section 230 immunity can pose challenges for federal agencies in civil enforcement matters. It is questionable whether Section 230 was intended to allow companies to invoke Section 230 immunity against the federal government acting to protect American consumers in the civil enforcement context. This contributes to the creation of a different set of rules for enforcing consumer protections against online companies compared to those in the offline world. Madam President, I'm grateful to Senator Schatz for his work on this bill, and I'm proud of what we've put together. We've both done a lot of work on these issues, and this bill is a serious, bipartisan solution to some of the problems that have arisen around Section 230. Our hearing yesterday, which included one of the original authors of Section 230 of the Section 230 provision, former Representative Chris Cox, confirmed that the PACT Act would go a long way toward making our user-generated internet sites more accountable to consumers. I look forward to working with Senator Schatz to advance our legislation in the Senate, and I hope that we'll see a vote on our bill in the near future. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Oh,
Minority Whip is recognized.
Madam President, to date, America has lost nearly 150,000
they're going in today, guys.
with diseases related to coronavirus. We are quickly approaching 5 million cases of infections in the United States of America. Consider this for a moment. The United States has 5% of the world's population. We have almost 25% of all the COVID infections in the world. How did we reach this point? That we have such a rampant rate of infection in what's considered the most developed nation on earth. Part of the problem is a president who peddles worthless medical advice. And part of the problem is that the Republican Senate has been unwilling to face the economic hardships which have been created by this pandemic in our economy. It was 10 and a half weeks ago, the House of Representatives, under Democratic control, and Speaker Pelosi passed the HEROES Act. 10 and a half weeks ago, they knew this day was coming, when the unemployment benefits that we put in the original legislation would expire, as they will this week, when the help for those who were renting to meet their obligations would expire, as it did last week. So 10 and a half weeks ago, Speaker Pelosi put on the table her proposal to deal with America after these things occurred. Today on the floor of the Senate, Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, called her efforts, quote, a loony ideological fantasy. Loony ideological fantasy. Well, the obvious question to Senator McConnell, who is the leader of the majority here in the United States Senate, is, where have you been for the last 10 and a half weeks? Where is the Republican alternative, the Republican substitute? Why have we not seen that come forward and a real negotiation take place between the House and the Senate? Well, for the longest time, Senator McConnell told us he just did not feel, quote, a sense of urgency to take up this matter. Did not feel a sense of urgency. Well, history was made in the Senate chamber this last Monday because Senator McConnell came to the floor and actually used the word urgent. Finally, urgency is stirring in his loins, and he announced this week a Republican alternative, but not quite. What he announced was a series of bills to be introduced by the Republican side. A series of bills. We are just days away. We are days away from the situation where these issues are expiring, like unemployment assistance. And yet, in this circumstance, we are dealing with a problem where we do not have alternatives from the Republican side. Oh, we have some. And one was addressed this morning when we came to the unemployment assistance. Understand what happened last March 26th when we passed the CARES Act. This bill passed 96-0 in the Senate chamber. Unanimous, bipartisan. But when we sat down to establish the amount of money to be given to unemployed workers in America, we ran into a problem, one we didn't anticipate. The Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration, Secretary Scalia, came to us, sat down at a table and said, you have a lot of interesting formulas when it comes to unemployment compensation, but just remember the reality. And the reality is that 50 different states have 50 different computer systems, some of which are very modern and up to speed, and others are ancient and not up to speed. When you start coming up with complex federal formulas for sending money to unemployed workers in these states, you're going to run into 50 different reactions. And that's exactly what we faced. So the alternative was simple. We either gave a flat dollar amount in the federal unemployment benefit supplement, or we just wondered what the states might do with any other formula. So the decision was made with the White House, with the Republicans, for the $600 a week federal supplement to unemployment. There was argument on the floor that some workers may come out ahead if that happens. Well, undoubtedly that might be the case because this federal supplement was in addition to whatever a person qualified for state unemployment. And each state has a different formula for state unemployment assistance, and each worker has a different work experience and salary experience. But we went forward believing that we needed to do something dramatic and significant for the economy. And the first place to start was with unemployed workers. And economists will tell you when you're facing a recession, when there's a lack of consumer demand, the first dollar you want to hand out as a government is to an unemployed worker. You know they're going to spend it. They have to spend it to pay the rent, the mortgage, utility bills, put food on the table, clothes on the kids, pay for health insurance. So we put the money into the economy and it worked. We managed to slow the decline of the economy, even though we see more unemployment still coming around. It would have been much worse if we hadn't made this commitment and investment in unemployment benefits. So now, with the expiration of this federal unemployment benefit program on July the 31st, just a few days away, the question is, what will we replace it with? Democrats proposed in the HEROES Act in the House that we extend the current program to the end of this year. That is certainly a direct way to deal with this, and one that would provide assistance to these families that would continue. The Republicans have come up with a much different approach. What they have suggested is we take the $600 a week federal supplement and reduce it to $200 a week. And then by October 1st, we require the states to implement a program that would give the unemployed workers 70% of their last wage. They have obviously ignored what Secretary Scalia told us just a few months ago, and that is that the states would run into a terrible challenge trying to meet this new Republican standard of 70% of your last paycheck. We were told we couldn't do that back in March. Has the landscape changed so much when it comes to state computer systems? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. In Illinois, we have a good system, but it's been dramatically overwhelmed by the federal supplemental payment and the new pandemic unemployment insurance and other provisions which we passed in Washington. So to think that we can move to a new formula in Illinois while meeting our current obligations is very difficult in our state, which we think is more modern than some. Having said that, though, the Republicans have argued that if by October 1st you can't provide 70% by formula to the unemployed workers, I suppose they'll go back to the $200 a week. It's unclear. So what's behind this? What's at the heart of this? Well, there are several things that I think need to be noted on the floor. Here is the assumption. Listen to this. You've heard it over and over, and we heard it again this morning. The assumption that has been made by the Republicans in their approach to unemployment insurance. They assume that if people are receiving $600 a week in a federal supplement to unemployment, that they're going to refuse to go back to work, even when offered a job. They're making more money to stay home than they did on the job. At least that's what's been repeated over and over again. Madam President, this morning I'd like to put in the record an article from the Yale News. And this Yale study, which was just released this week, says, the Yale study finds expanded jobless benefits did not reduce employment. Exactly the opposite of what we've heard over and over again from the Republican side. This report from Yale economists said as follows. It found that workers receiving larger increases in unemployment benefits experienced very similar gains in employment by early May relative to workers with less generous benefit increases. People with more generous expanded benefits also resumed working at a similar or slightly quicker rate than others did, according to the report. Quote, the data do not show a relationship between benefit generosity and employment path under the CARES Act, which could be due to the collapse of labor demand during the COVID-19 crisis. Put in simple terms, there aren't that many jobs out there looking for workers. And as it turns out, some workers, unemployed, have gone back to work, even though they might make slightly less than they did under unemployment. Why? The reason's obvious. Unemployment is a temporary benefit. Unemployment may not be as good and generous as what a person has in the workplace when you count the benefits that come with some jobs. And ultimately, many workers unemployed today want to get back to work. We should not assume, as some politicians do, that if a person is unemployed, they must be lazy. With 47 million unemployed Americans, that is hardly the case. And certainly when it comes to whether or not people have the incentive to go back to work, I believe most Americans do want to work. And the notion that we have to change the whole system for fear that some might not is definitely unfair. Let me just say that as we move forward with this, I see a colleague on the floor seeking recognition in a few minutes. As we move forward with this attempt to deal with the economy, we have to face the reality. And the reality is, as made clear by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, But if we take our foot off the accelerator right now, we're going to plunge over the cliff in a deeper economic mess than we're in today. They're trying by every means in monetary policy and the interest rates to enliven this economy and create an environment where it may reopen soon, and I hope that happens. But if we take the Republican approach, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, it's not going to work. We're going to find ourselves with a recession that's even worse. And for those deficit hawks, how badly do you think our deficit will look if we face an even deeper recession? It's going to get worse, and dramatically so. Shouldn't our first obligation be to the workers across America who've lost their jobs so they can keep their families together? This notion of cutting the federal benefit from $600 a week to $200 a week, I can guarantee you, will mean much more traffic and activity at the food pantries and around America as these unemployed families try to keep things together. And then there's a proposal from the Republican side for a 3-martini lunch federal tax break. 3-martini lunch. Is that the way out of our economic morass? And at the same time, they're encouraging the 3-martini lunch federal tax break. They won't give any additional assistance to those who are receiving SNAP benefits. That's low-income Americans who are needing some help just to feed their families. It seems that things are upside down. The last point I'll make is this. Senator McConnell has said repeatedly for months, nothing is going to happen in the Senate, nothing, to help anybody in America unless he gets his wish to give immunity to American corporations from coronavirus lawsuits. Finally, we get to see his proposal. It was released this week. I want to tell you, this is the most dramatic tort reform proposal I've seen since I've served in the United States Senate. It basically takes away the rights of workers as well as those who are customers in businesses from recovering under a coronavirus lawsuit. It lowers the standard of care that is required of businesses to a level which basically will not protect Americans that face this pandemic across the country. And at the same time, it is providing assistance and relief. It is unfortunately creating an environment where some businesses, unfortunately, will not be as careful as they should be in the way they conduct their businesses with customers and their employees. We know that we face a challenge here with this pandemic, but giving this kind of corporate break when it comes to immunity and liability only will make things more dangerous for customers and employees across the United States of America. And let me say a word about what has been said on the floor over and over again by Senator Cornyn and Senator McConnell, the so-called tsunami of lawsuits, the epidemic of frivolous lawsuits, the trial lawyers on parade to the courthouse because of this pandemic. Well, we've checked every lawsuit filed in the United States this year that mentions the word coronavirus or COVID-19. Do you know how many medical malpractice cases have been filed so far this calendar year with this so-called tsunami of lawsuits? 6. And how many personal injury cases have been filed this year mentioning COVID-19 or coronavirus? This epidemic, this flood of lawsuits, 15 across the entire United States of America. It's an imaginary problem that they're creating at this point. We can deal with it. 28 states have already by changing their state laws, but giving immunity to corporations from coronavirus lawsuits will not make us safer, will not make the workplace safer for workers or the business safer for customers. If we're going to restore consumer confidence, everybody has to pull together. We ought to have standards established by the CDC based on public health and not politics. And businesses, conscientious businesses, I am sure will follow those standards because they do care. Currently, we don't have these standards, and this effort will make it even less likely that we will. I yield the floor.
Woo!
Mr. President, Senator from Pennsylvania.
It's been a busy day today, guys.
I rise this morning to cover a couple of topics. One of some comments on the legislation that I hope we're going to complete to provide relief to the nation with regard to both the public health crisis and the jobs crisis. And then I'll have 2 other sets of remarks in different parts of the record. But let me start with what we're facing right now. We know that it's been 4 months since the CARES Act, way back at the end of March. And we all expected, I think, at that time that piece of legislation and then the legislation prior thereto and subsequently would have an impact on Americans. We hoped in a positive way, and I think there's some evidence to indicate that the CARES Act had a positive impact. Obviously not perfect legislation, but I don't think any of us thought that was the end of the road. And then we saw just 10 weeks ago, the HEROES Act passed the House of Representatives. So you have the CARES Act enacted into law and operative, and thank goodness for that, as well as several other pieces of legislation. But the HEROES Act only passed by the House and no action by the Senate in those intervening 10 weeks. If you were on the majority side of the aisle, the Republican side, as Leader McConnell has outlined, and you wanted to wait to see the full impact of the CARES Act, there's an argument that some would make in that direction. I don't agree with it. But what I don't understand is why, even if you believe that you should wait, why you would not be preparing for the worst, preparing for the kind of outbreaks we've seen across the country when the virus moved away from the Northeast generally to the South and Southwest and then to the West even more so. Why you would not prepare at least an outline of legislation, why you would not begin negotiations many, many weeks ago, as opposed to waiting till the last minute, not just to respond to the overall problem, the worst public health challenge in a century, but also in a particular way, why would you wait, as the majority did, to the very last minute on the issue of unemployment insurance, when we know benefits are running out now in a matter of hours, really, even not even a few days now. So if that's your perspective that we should have waited, why wouldn't you prepare for the worst? So that when the worst was hitting or something comparable to that, you would have legislation ready to go. The majority chose to delay, and I think in a real sense seemed to adopt the president's kind of virus denial, that if you just don't talk about it, if you try to change the subject, or in the case of the majority, if you don't legislate about it, or just prepare to legislate about it, it will somehow recede into the background and we don't have to worry about it. Well, that delay and that denial has proved to be, I think, misguided, and I think that's being charitable. So we're faced with a number of challenges at the same time as we face a public health and jobs crisis. I'll start with nursing homes and long-term care and the very related issue of home and community-based services. We know that in long-term care settings, most of those settings being nursing homes, the nation has endured more than 59,000 deaths. That number may have hit 60,000, but we know that it is more than 59,000 deaths. So more than 40% of all the deaths in the United States of America, which is now about to reach 151,000, I think at last, from what we saw this morning. More than 40% of those
I'm going to refresh the screen, guys. It's getting a little choppy. Most of them in nursing homes.
This isn't theoretical to people out there. This isn't theoretical to families across my home state of Pennsylvania or a lot of other states, where in many states, 60% or more of all the deaths were in long-term care settings. The deaths are, of course, residents of those nursing homes, in addition to workers. So when you combine resident deaths and worker deaths, you get more than 59,000. We got to ask ourselves, as Americans, is that just going to be acceptable? Are we going to stand here 3 months from now, or 4 months, or 6 months from now and say, wow, it's really tragic, all these deaths, and another 59,000 people died in long-term care settings, mostly nursing homes? Is that the America we want? Is that the America we're going to settle for? And all I know, I can hear the arguments. Oh, you know, it's a terrible virus. It is. It's a virus that hits the very old in disproportionately higher numbers. And if you happen to be an older citizen and you have all kinds of chronic conditions or other health issues that might compromise your immune system or otherwise, you are especially susceptible. So some would argue, well, this is just going to happen. But Mr. President, we know exactly how to get the numbers down. The case numbers down and the death numbers. Is it perfect? No. Can we get the 59,000 to zero? Of course not. No one would argue that. But the idea that the United States of America, in addition to not responding effectively to the onset of the virus itself, I'm just talking about a subset or a part of the tragedy, and that's the tragedy in our nursing homes, both for residents and their families and for workers and their families. We know exactly what works, and I've got a bill that would substantially reduce the deaths and the cases. What is it? Well, first of all, it's important to know the number, 3768, that's the bill. And I would hope that my bill would be included wholly or in substantial fashion in the next bill. Senate Bill 3768, what does it do? It allocates $20 billion. Now, we've heard numbers that this next piece of legislation might hit $1 trillion or more, and I think that's likely. We should ask ourselves, can we set aside $20 billion of that, a fraction of that $1 trillion plus or more bill that we will pass, we hope? Can we set aside a fraction of that for older citizens and their families and the workers that take care of them? These are Americans who fought our wars. They worked in our factories. They built the strongest middle class the world has ever seen over the course of the last 75 or so years. These are people who were inventors and innovators. These are people who made America what it is today. They are our fathers and our mothers, our grandmothers and grandfathers. They gave us life and love. The least that we could do is make an American effort to get the death number down and the case number down. And anyone who says we can't do that is defeatist, and I think invoking an anti-American spirit. We know how to do this. What will the $20 billion go for? It's real simple, but could be profound in its impact. Number one, we know that one practice in a nursing home that reduces the case number, the number of cases of people contracting the virus and the death number is cohorting. What does that mean? Separating those with the virus in the nursing home from those who don't have it. Nursing homes who did that were successful in getting their numbers down. And they did it early, like way back in early March, maybe even earlier in some cases. And it worked. And it's been implemented in a number of states. But that has a cost to it. You might have to build out, you might have to retrofit, and you also need extra dollars for personal protective equipment. There should be no question that in the United States of America, every nursing home has every piece of personal protective equipment it needs. PPE is life-saving. Life-saving for the resident to be guarded from contracting the virus and essential for the workers as well. What else do we need the money for? Well, if you got a problem in a nursing home with an outbreak, we ought to be able to surge expertise from other settings. That nursing home might need more doctors in that crisis or that outbreak. Might need more nurses or certified nurses assistants or other personnel. We should have the dollars at the state level to surge those professionals. Also need more money for testing in nursing homes. Vitally important. So I think families across the country expect us to directly address this. Unfortunately, the Republican bill proposed the other day does not do that, does not invest as my bill would. Here's the headline from just this week, July 24th, New York Times. I won't read the story, but the headline is, FEMA sends faulty protective gear to nursing homes battling virus. Faulty protective gear. We're months into this, And we've got FEMA sending faulty protective gear. Here's the first line of the story: expired surgical masks, isolation gowns that resemble oversized trash bags, extra small gloves that are all but useless for the typical health worker's hands. Goes on and on. Don't have time to do it today. But that article and so many other documented reports indicate that these facilities don't have the protective gear that they need. Second issue, Mr. President, unemployment insurance. We're told that the majority in their proposal wants to cut the $600 per week down to $200. So do the math, cutting it by $400 a week. This is at a time when we're told that since February, the United States has lost 15 million jobs. My recollection is in the Great Recession of around a decade ago, between the fall of 08 and sometime in the spring of 09, roughly, about 8.5 million jobs were lost. We've already lost basically double of that, 15 million jobs. And we were told, oh, don't worry, April's going to be a bad month and May and June are going to be a lot better. And it's just going to, that unemployment rate is just going to roll down from there. And I was hoping that was the case. But in Pennsylvania, in April, 1 million unemployed. What was May? Fortunately, it went down, 849. I expected June in our state to be a lot lower than 849. Maybe it'd go down by 100,000 or 150,000. I hope even more. But unfortunately, it went from 849 to about 821. 821,000 people out of work in Pennsylvania in the month of June. So we still have a jobs crisis that will endure for a good while yet, and therefore an unemployment crisis. The worst time to cut those benefits, those extra benefits, would be right now. And I know we've heard the argument that if you continue this, you're creating a disincentive to work. That's what we're told. Well, according to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, in a report this month, just a couple of days ago, this is what they found, quote, lack of opportunities to work, not a disincentive to work, are keeping unemployment elevated, unquote. That's what they found. They documented more than that statement would entail. But that's what they found in their research. They also found that 23% fewer job openings in July of 20 versus July of 19. So fewer job openings. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the Department of Labor said that almost 4 unemployed in the United States for every job opening. Third issue, state and local funding. The Republican proposal has nothing to help states and local governments. Now, we know that state and local governments got to balance their budgets. So extra dollars can only come from one source, the federal government. State and local governments have had to spend more to protect their citizens with the onset of the virus and the disease COVID-19, and that the impact of the virus and the pandemic blew a hole in their budgets. So what's going to happen? Well, when a state, whether it's a red state or blue state or whatever the political conditions, they're all the same when it comes to revenue loss. Here's what's going to happen. As sure as night follows day, they're going to have to cut education. So I would say to school districts, get ready for cuts, because if your state cannot balance its budget, there are going to be education cuts, and there'll be cuts to health care, probably Medicaid in most instances. And there'll be other cuts. Public transit. We were on a call last night with transit advocates from around Pennsylvania, and our side is asking for more help for transit. But you can go down a long list, whether it's education or healthcare or even public safety itself at the local level. So we should do a lot more. We should be replicating something, or at least approximating what the House did when they allocated $875 billion for state and local government combined. How about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program?
Refreshing the page, guys.
The majority has refused over and over again, categorically refused, to increase SNAP by the percentage that our side has argued for. I know it's a little easy in Washington to talk about hunger and food insecurity as some kind of distant issue, because those of us who serve in this chamber are not food insecure. We don't have to suffer the pain of hunger that so many families are suffering. Many of who suffer food insecurity long before the pandemic, but many others, even middle-class families or people trying to get to the middle class, suffering from food insecurity because of the virus and the economic downturn. Families, we know, are literally choosing between the food that they need for their families or paying the mortgage, choosing between the food they need, groceries, versus paying for their kids' medications. Last issue in this part of my remarks, Mr. President, on Medicaid. We know that the Senate did the right thing in the Families First legislation way back in early March, when it increased the matching dollars for Medicaid by 6.2%. Those matching dollars are vital for states to be able to pay for Medicaid and to be able to balance their budgets. I believe in the House bill, the HEROES Act, passed 10 weeks ago, would set forth another increase of a higher amount, 14% for those matching dollars. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when people are losing their jobs every day. We just read a story in the New York Times last week, I think it was, more than 5 million people in the country have lost their health insurance because they lost their job or for other reasons. So a lot of those folks that are out of luck when it comes to healthcare itself are turning to Medicaid. So we should increase the matching rate to 14%. Now, the Republican proposal has no additional dollars for Medicaid. And this, I guess we should not be surprised, because the White House budget proposals the last several years, and I think supported in large measure by the Republican majority here in the Senate, has not only not wanted to increase dollars for Medicaid, in fact, the White House has proposed cuts of several $100 billion to Medicaid over a 10-year time frame, several years in a row. And Republicans in the Senate have said very little against that, if anything, against those kinds of proposals. Mr. President, let me just move to a separate set of remarks, and I'd ask consent to place these remarks in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Just some remarks about United States Representative John Lewis, whose casket just left in a hearse from the grounds of the Capitol just this morning. And it was moving to see the number of people who would stand in line for a long period of time in 97 or 99 degree heat to pass by his casket. John Lewis, there's so much we could say about him. Difficult to summarize or encapsulate or not repeat ourselves, but I think in so many ways John Lewis was courage personified. Very, very few Americans, other than those who served in combat itself, or in other instances, could say that they have put themselves on the line like he did. His courage in the face of hatred, in the face of brutal beatings and otherwise. John Lewis helped the United States in its ongoing work to form a more perfect union. And there's so much more we could say about that. He was beaten on multiple occasions for standing up for civil rights and, of course, the right to vote itself. And he did all of this, by practicing nonviolence. I don't know how he did that. I really don't. I'd like to be able to think that I could do that in the face of beatings. But I don't think I could. I really doubt that I could, and most people could. But he practiced nonviolence and thereby had a huge impact on the American people and American law. Served 33 years here in the United States House of Representatives, also served on the Atlanta City Council. When President Obama was bestowing the Medal of Freedom on John Lewis, he said, quote, that John Lewis was, quote, the conscience of the United States Congress. So well said. I think at a time like this, we're summoned by his enduring example. We're summoned by his heroic example to pass the Voting Rights Bill, H.R. 4, which has been basically sitting here since December when they passed it. That's the best way to demonstrate our gratitude for John Lewis's contributions. So the fight against injustice must continue. We can't just say what a great man he was, what a great leader he was. We have to continue to be inspired by and act against injustice, whether it's in housing or food insecurity or education or employment or healthcare or otherwise. Martin Luther King said one time, "Until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." John Lewis's life was in furtherance of that goal, to bring about a world where justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I think John Lewis was a patriot in the broadest sense of the word. And we know from America the Beautiful, that wonderful line in America the Beautiful, "Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years." That the dream of a patriot, when they're fighting on a battlefield, is not just about the fight they're in. The dream of a patriot is about, of course, what happens after. That their sacrifice brings about a better world, a more secure country in the context of a war, a battle. John Lewis also had the dream of a patriot, the dream of a better life for Americans, the dream of equal protection under the law, the dream of voting rights being protected. So in the largest sense of the word, John Lewis was a patriot. Mr. President, I'm almost done. I know I might be over time, and I know we have a colleague waiting. Just let me very briefly just ask consent for a second time to have these remarks in a separate place of the record.
Without objection.
And I will be brief, and I apologize for going a little long. But we know that there's been a lot of debate about what happened when we had reports in the New York Times and other reports in June about the U.S. intelligence community learning that Russian intelligence had offered payments as high as $100,000 transferred through a middleman to kill United States service members in Afghanistan. I know that we don't have time to get into all the details of that today, but we know that the president has, I think on the record, not said anything about this.
I was going to leave, but this is getting good.
And in my judgment, he did not address and did not respond appropriately to that, to those reports. I was hoping what the president would say in the interview that I saw on television this morning, I guess it was yesterday, and that he would have said long before that, is that we're going to investigate this and we're going to make a determination about the conclusion that we reach, that he would reach as president, and that he would directly confront Vladimir Putin and challenge him on this. But he had a recent phone call with him, and all the reporting indicates, and even the president indicated in his interview, that he did not challenge Vladimir Putin. That is beyond disturbing, and I think it's not in furtherance of our national security interests. So in the interest of time today, I won't say more, but I know we are over time, but Mr. President, I just have one consent and then I'm done. I'm sorry. On behalf of Senator Durbin, I ask unanimous consent that the Yale excerpt be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask permission to complete my remarks prior to the vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will begin by saying it's interesting to hear my colleague talk about China and COVID and our response. I think many of us looked at 2019 and felt like that was really a significant year for U.S.-China relations. It marked the 40th anniversary of bilateral diplomatic relations between Washington and Beijing, and we also finalized a phase 1 trade deal. And this led many of us to being optimistic. But remember that 2019 also marked the 70th anniversary of Chairman Mao's ascension to the chairmanship of the Chinese Communist Party and the 30th anniversary of the massacre at Tiananmen Square. When you start asking questions about that history and how it has informed the decisions of current Chinese leadership, the capitalist facade that has been so carefully constructed by the propagandist in Beijing starts to peel away and it starts to crack. But after decades of espionage, military aggression, and horrific political violence inflicted on their own people, many here in Washington have grown numb to Chinese hostility. They kind of expect or accept that's the way they're going to act. That's the only explanation I could come up with for the shock that rippled through this town when we discovered that the Chinese Communist Party spent 51 days muzzling the doctors, lawyers, journalists who desperately tried to warn the rest of the world about the growing threat from the novel coronavirus. Our relationship with China has reached a tipping point. We will never be able to go back to what had been that cautious optimism that we had in 2019. Fortunately, it looks like both my colleagues here in Washington and many of our allies are allowing themselves to process the threat posed by Beijing's standard operating procedures. The UK has banned the use of equipment from Chinese tech giant Huawei for their ongoing 5G rollout, and France has implemented policies that restrict the use of Huawei's products. These decisions are giving some hope to the people that I'm talking to back in Tennessee every single day. They are happy to see that allies are following in our footsteps. This is a good thing. It's an opportunity for us to role model how you work to unravel a relationship with an aggressor. And they would also want me to tell you that they appreciate the Senate's growing bipartisan support for legislation like my SAMC Act, which will secure our pharmaceutical supply chains from Chinese interference, and Senator McSally's Civil Justice for Victims of COVID Act, which will allow Americans harmed by this pandemic to sue the Chinese Communist Party officials in U.S. court.
Wow.
But Mr. President, we all know that there's no single shot bill we can use to decouple from China and put control back in the hands of American businesses, educators, institutions, and innovators. We have to begin to unravel these ties with China. Now, there are a lot of people in this town who think that this is impossible, and they will say, oh, that is ill-advised. You do not want to try to unravel from China. I think they're wrong, and I think that we can, and we must do this. But lip service is not going to cut it. Over the past few months, we've talked at length about what needs to be done, but with few exceptions, we are light on specifics. So last Wednesday, I published a white paper laying out the current state of affairs.
Excuse the noise, guys. I have construction in the building.
And China, and talked about what got us to this position. And then I have 120 specific policy recommendations that Congress can use as a basis for future legislation, whether it's trade or agriculture or telecommunications or 5G or our military complex. And I'd like to use my remaining time to lay out a few of these recommendations as a place to start. By now, most Americans are at least familiar with the term Belt and Road Initiative. This is an investment program that the Chinese have used to buy their way. They have bought their way into the good graces of governments in Asia, Africa, and Europe. This trillions of dollars in investment buys inroads and influence across countries of every economic background and in organizations like the United Nations. And while we cannot and should not compete dollar for dollar, we should partner with our allies to prevent struggling governments from falling into this debt diplomacy or these debt traps. We must also secure our supply chains across every sector of our economy and bring critical manufacturing and technologies back to the United States. I mentioned the SAMC Act. It would incentivize companies to bring their manufacturing operations back to the U.S. and also fund partnerships between pharmaceutical companies and universities so that they can train the workforce we need in order to pull this manufacturing out of China and bring it back to communities right here. We should not hesitate in moving forward on this legislation. And once we invest in this new technology and infrastructure, we're going to have to invest in securing it by securing our emerging 5G networks. To that end, we need to make more spectrum available for the commercial wireless sector to ensure our continued leadership in 5G and other emerging technologies. If we fail to do so, we risk ceding ground to China and the standard setting bodies that are going to define 5G internationally. We won't be able to stop China alone. We must look toward those international organizations as well as allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to help us deter Chinese aggression and foster stable economic growth. This includes providing support for Hong Kong and Taiwan and promoting universal human rights standards both in China and across the globe. We will also increase defense investment in the region through a newly created Pacific Deterrence Initiative. But most importantly, we must accept the fact that at its core, China is not a normal country. It does not behave like a normal country. When Xi Jinping ascended to the head of the Chinese Communist Party in 2012, many assumed he was going to act as a reformer and turn away from the Maoist thought. But predictably, he did not. We cannot simply wait for this problem to go away. Last week, Beijing escalated tensions by ordering Americans to vacate our only consulate in Western China, distancing its abuses in Tibet and Xinjiang from American diplomatic personnel. And you know what? It's not going to stop with this. They are accelerating their aggression. We have to become more independent of China. We are too dependent on them at this point. It is time for the United States to deny this era of Chinese impunity and change the way we're doing business. It's time to reestablish rules to guide the global economy, to encourage our allies to join us, and to hold Beijing accountable. I yield the floor.
Senator, jump in. We'd love to hear from you guys. All right. This video I'm going to trim down smaller. So if you're watching this video after it's been trimmed, subscribe and make sure you don't miss the next live. I would love to hear your input. And if you comment, I'll go ahead and put your comment up, just like a bunch of you guys who have commented today. All right. Really appreciate you guys for showing up. I really love doing this type of content. It's a little bit different from what I do on my other channel, but I get to hear from you guys and see your opinions on other topics. And I think that is so awesome, guys. All right, guys, see you tomorrow. Blessings and have a great day.